This is ground control to Major Tom. Our talk today is going to be about the future. Most particularly, the future of water. Now, I'm going to talk about 3 books that deal with the topic of water. The first is a book by Fred Pearce called When the Rivers Run Dry. It's about the global water crisis. The second book is called Stillicide by Cynan Jones, a novel. And the third book that you may have heard of is Night of the Long Goodbyes by this guy called Erik Martiny, who happens to be me, as you know. So now I'll begin with the first one, which is When the Rivers Run Dry. Now this is not a novel, it's an essay, an extended essay, and it is one of the most interesting books I've ever read. So I really highly recommend it. This book was in a bit of a postal accident, but it's usually in better condition than this. Now it's a very prescient, insightful, well-informed study of the global water crisis and all the ramifications of mismanagement of water. Now, why deal with the environment when we're already submerged by a virus crisis, you might ask? Well, I would say that, as you probably know, the virus crisis is linked to the environment, the way we mismanaged animals, putting them in the same cages, for example, in China. But also the crisis has taken such a heavy toll because of pollution. The virus affects people who have asthma and emphysema the most, and that's caused by pollution. And it's even been said that the virus piggybacks on little particles in the air, which allows the virus to spread more easily. So the environment is really at the heart of this situation and needs to concern us as much as the virus, and even more so in coming months. Now, the global water crisis might seem secondary to the air pollution crisis, but it is also linked to the heating up of the planet and greenhouse gases, as you'll see. Now, the average consumer who guzzles milk and beer and eats meat in the West uses up 100 times their own weight every single day. Now, if you're a vegan, you apparently consume only half that amount. It takes a staggering 1,320 gallons, and let me remind you that a gallon is 4.5 liters, to grow a small steak. Right? So just keeping the cow alive, feeding the cow, all the crops that are needed to be watered to feed the cow, etc. It takes that much, right, to grow just a little steak. Right, just one T-shirt takes up 25 full bathtubs of water, of what's called virtual water, in that it's grown elsewhere thanks to water. So there's water mismanagement is pretty drastic, and we need to go towards more water conservation. Now, if you think about the political ramifications of this, the most striking example is in the Lake Chad basin, where people are starting to join Boko Haram because of the drying up of the lake and the loss of resources from that lake. Now, the Green Revolution in the 70s was the growing of particularly high-yielding crops, and it saved people from the scourge of starvation in many countries, in India most particularly. But what we really need now that we've achieved the Green Revolution is a Blue Revolution, so that water is managed far more carefully than it is today. So the new high yield crops that were grown during the revolution, during the Green Revolution, and also today, tend to yield less crops per drop, right? So they're very thirsty crops. They tend to water guzzle a lot. And in some arid countries, the paradox really is that 90% of their water usage comes from irrigation. Right? So the countries that have the least water are the ones that use the most water to grow crops for us, right, in the West. Crops like rice that tend to water guzzle a lot. Wheat guzzles less water than rice, but still a lot. The worst is rice because you need rice paddies, and the rice paddies have to be flooded constantly with water. But as we'll see, there are techniques that can be used to avoid flooding and wasting of water. Now, another problem is salt. A lot of the fields around the world are becoming covered with salt. Right? That sounds like a bit of a science fiction scenario, but since the 1990s, an area the size of France is now covered in salt in various parts of the world. So it's a growing problem, and it needs to be addressed. Now, the salt comes from rivers that carry it from rocks in the mountains. It's not sea salt. There is also salination that comes from the sea. In America, for example, the sea comes in and leaves all its salt when it withdraws. But this is salt coming from the mountains. It's also salt that is caused by dams. Dams tend to flood areas, and they leave a lot of salt. So this is something that needs to be addressed. It should become a global priority, right? The salt damaged lands. Now, because the demand for food is set to increase by 2/3 by mid-century, we need to find ways to grow more crops with less water. Right? So a bit of a quandary there. America, for instance, is losing the West as we speak. Right? It gained the West, it closed the western frontier at the end of the 19th century. It is now slowly losing the West to drought. Now, rivers like the Colorado River flow across 7 states in the West. Now, upstream you have Colorado, the state of Colorado, and downstream you have Arizona and California and Nevada. And so the states that are downstream tend to get far less water. Now, places like Phoenix, Arizona, for example, tend to be profligate with water. They use water in what they call landscaping. You know, water features like fountains that are like several dozens of feet high. So it's a lot of it is wasted in this way, which means that in the bad years there will be no water by the time it reaches the sea, if it reaches the sea at all. A lot of the world's rivers, as Fred Pearce points out, don't actually get to the sea anymore, right? So the maps that you have are actually mendacious, right? They tell you a false geographical feature, because the rivers don't actually make it to the sea, a lot of them. So there is a hydrological crisis in the West. Now in California they've been very proactive about it, in that you get a rebate if you decide to scrap your lawn, cement it over, so that you don't have to sprinkle it with water anymore. Golf courses are being shut down so that there is enough water to go around. So they've been a model of water conservation. They're becoming a model. Las Vegas, most particularly, right? Las Vegas comes across as, you know, the kind of Babylon of modern times in some ways, but it's actually a model of water conservation. It kind of has to be out there in the desert. So this overpumping is coming to a halt slowly, but you know too slowly. So that there's going to be a more drastic crisis in the future. Now, China is at the forefront of technology in terms of water management, but unfortunately some of this is probably mismanagement. Now, they are the #1 providers of dams in the world. They're the greatest dam builders. They are in the process of building 3 more mega dams on the Mekong River. And these mega dams will be so capacious that they will be able to hold half of the flow of the Mekong River. Right? A huge amount of water. Now, so that sounds good, right? Hydroelectricity, right? Green electricity, until you realize that it means that because they have they'll have the hegemony over water, the people who are downstream, right, in other countries such as Cambodia, are going to be accusing China of water theft. They already are, in fact. In that there are natural floodplains in Cambodia that people rely on for fisheries. Right? The Mekong tends to flood, right? So it floods vast areas of forest, which sounds bad, but is actually very good for the ecosystem, for birds and so on, and fish. But also for men who need the fish. It also regenerates the forest, as it's only temporary, right? It's a seasonal flood. It doesn't stay there, so the wood doesn't rot, and methane doesn't come out of the rotting wood. So that's going to be a problem in the future, and could lead to water wars in various parts of the world. Now, so food security in Cambodia is going to be on the line in the future because of these mega dams. Fred Pearce is very anti-dam. He tends to dam dams for the reason that they are not as efficient as they seem. Now, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and since then, every nation wants its Hoover Dam, right? A huge dam that was built in America That model is a kind of ego builder for politicians and engineers alike, and so most countries want their mega dam, especially in, well, the current ecological revolution. It sounds like a very clean energy idea. Now the problem is that in some parts of the world these dams create more problems than they solve. They don't green the desert as they said they would. So in the Amazon basin, for example, there's a huge dam that actually rots the wood in the forest because it's a permanent feature. And this rotting wood, emits methane, which, as you probably know, emits 20 times more greenhouse gases than carbon. So you have this paradox where hydroelectricity actually pollutes more because of this methane than fossil fuels. So dams tend to deliver a lot of salt to fields. Also, they bring disease in the form of mosquitoes that tend to fester and grow and prosper in the dam areas. So malaria is going to be spreading, and is already spreading more because of these dams. Now, another major problem in the conservation of water is evaporation. Evaporation is immense, right? If you think about just Lake Nasser in Egypt, the amount of water that evaporates from Lake Nasser is equivalent to all the water consumed in taps in England, right? So water completely wasted for no reason because of the heat. So the solutions that Fred Pearce offers in this book, and it is ultimately very positive and not just fascinating in the problems it brings to light, but also in the solutions it offers. So the first solution to water evaporation, in Fred Pearce's view, is the building of solar panels over water dams and reservoirs, right? So that the water doesn't heat as much. You capture the water under the solar panels, and the solar panels provide solar energy, right? So you're killing two birds with the one stone. Now, another major solution offered by Fred Pearce is the recycling of sewage. Now, sewage is something we tend to want to get rid of. We tend to flush and forget. When we're actually wasting extremely precious resources, extremely precious nutrients that sewage contains. Sewage can be used to irrigate fields and fertilize them at the same time, right? So as Fred Pearce points out, we need to put our poo in the right place. Now, sewage used directly on fields can be a bit of a health hazard, which is originally why it was got rid of and flushed out into rivers and the sea. But if it's treated, this problem can be got rid of, right? So it needs to be treated. Well, some argue that the earth destroys the dangerous bacteria in sewage. Other scientists argue that it needs to be treated. So to be on the safe side, it could be treated easily to kill off pathogens. There are places like Singapore that are going to offer sewage, already do actually. They offer sewage on tap, right? So the tap water you use is recycled sewage water. So this is not particularly appealing, I agree, but the water treated in this way is actually cleaner than a lot of tap water. And if you mix it in with rainwater, the amount of sewage in there, of clean sewage is minimal. So the image of drinking sewage disappears to some extent. Singapore harvests runoff water from the streets also. It is an absolute model of water management. They used to depend on neighboring countries for their water, so they've now become water independent. Another country that is particularly good at conserving water is Israel. Now they have the largest desalination plants in the world, and have brought down the cost of desalinizing seawater. They also plug their leaks. A major problem is that leaks in the mains, leaks in the pipes. These can be plugged in with cement so that you don't lose vast quantities of water. In the West, we tend to waste a lot of water because of leaks. Right? So if you have the technology to measure the pressure along the pipes at every level of the pipe, then you know exactly when it occurs, and you can intervene quickly so that the leak is quickly plumbed and plugged. So this is what we need to do. We need to optimize our water management in these ways. Now, recycling sewage is one way. There's also an ancient way, which is rainwater harvesting. Now, before the British came to India, the Indians used to use cisterns in their gardens that would collect rainwater, and they would harvest it during the monsoon periods, and then they would just boil the water and drink it. Right? So this is a very healthy way of getting rid of any bacteria, and it allows you to have your own water in your own back garden. Right? So Fred Pearce suggests that we should return to these ancient ways, that every household could have its own backyard cistern. Another more poetic way of harvesting water is from fog harvesting. Right? So you can actually collect the water droplets in fog with large nets that capture the moisture. There is a study that has been made on Namibian beetles, and their body shape, the body shape of the Namibian beetle is such that it actually collects moisture from the air. Right? So it has this kind of strange body shape where it collects water on the air. The water collects here and drips down into the mouth of the beetle. So it doesn't even have to bend over to drink. It has its own water providing body. Now there's a patent that has been made on a bottle that can self-fill. Right? So these self-filling bottles, based on the shape of the Namibian beetle, so you can just put a bottle out there in the sun, and it will just fill up with water taken from the moisture in the air. Now, the last ways of conserving water is by seeding clouds. So this is a form of geoengineering where you send up silver iodide crystals into clouds. Right? You inject these iodide silver crystals into the clouds, and these make the clouds much thicker, and the rainfall is increased. Now, this technology is a little bit controversial in that some countries have accused others of rain theft, in that if it rains heavily in one area, we're not quite sure if that takes away from the rain in another area, right? So it's still pretty murky technology, but that, you know, that could be very useful in times of drought, in times of severe drought. Now, the last major point that Pearce makes is about floodplains. Now, flooding, we tend to see flooding as something very negative that causes deaths and a lot of material damage, and it does, of course. But he argues for natural flooding, which is what rivers do, right? Seasonal flooding across the world was always something that man worked around, and it's something that a river just naturally needs to do, right? So if you build a lot of embankments, a lot of dikes to keep the water nice and straight in the river, and evacuate it to the sea, what's often going to happen is that the flood occurs anyway. It just occurs in the wrong places, right? In cities. Some places should never have been built, like New Orleans, for example, is just in a flood area. It's in a floodplain. It just, you know, should never have been built in that particular area. So this leads me to a book, the second book, which is Stillicide by Cynan Jones. It's about a theory that Fred Pearce mentions, which is the towing of icebergs. Now, the towing of icebergs is not a myth. It's actually a technology that was considered, that has been considered since the 1970s. Saudi Arabia wanted to tow icebergs from the poles to use them, and it's Dassault, the French company, has evaluated that it would be viable. Now, it's still more expensive than desalination of seawater, because, well, for obvious reasons, the icebergs would melt considerably. It's calculated that up to 30-something% of the iceberg would disappear if it were towed from the Arctic down to places like Saudi Arabia, for instance. So it's not exactly a pipe dream. It would be feasible, more feasible to send it down to Texas, for example, during the droughts in Texas. Now, in this particular book, it's a novel. You have the idea that it's towed to England. It's not clear actually that it's set in England. It's one of those novels where you're not told much about the setting. So England, you know, would be much closer, of course, and the temperature much milder. So it's actually feasible. Right? It's not entirely a fantasy. So it's a book set in the future, when humanity is in the middle of a water crisis. So it's a kind of dystopia, but not in a very kind of dark way. If you look at pages 68, it talks about the notion of dystopia. People get on with it. People have always got on with it. Dystopia is as ridiculous a concept as utopia. Ultimately, we're animals, I say, thinking of the nature discs, and animals find ways. Right, so you have this a novel that refuses easy categorization as a dystopia, even though the atmosphere is a little bit dystopian in that the minimal plot is the characters in the novel are awaiting a water train. So water has been commodified. Well, it already is in our world, but even more so because it's becoming scarce. So everybody awaits these highly guarded water trains, and there is a group of terrorists, so that provides the tension in the novel, who want to bomb the water trains. So we have a world that is a kind of country of last things, as Paul Auster puts it in his novel, but it's not radically dark. Here's another little example of this blending of a slightly difficult world with rather a few rays of hope. Right, so he says on page 71, the results had been surprising. All very well, the doom and gloom, but the array of flowering species on the rooftops was astonishing. The city might be grey at ground level, but its rooftops were spectacular with bursts of life and colour. Mostly, the bees weren't even travelling very far. So you have a world in which water is scarce, but nature is regenerating itself. Some of the bees die during but it's nothing very dramatic. You feel that the rooftops on most houses are now green, and that all the insects are harvesting creating honey from nectar with their saliva, which is actually how you create honey, in case you didn't know. So you're actually spreading bee saliva on your bread, in case you didn't know. So there is this kind of a good balance between optimism and pessimism in this book. This being said, there is a bit of a cold feeling that this is a cautionary tale, and that we are heading for greater difficulties if we do not buckle up and manage our water more carefully. So the book is a rather modernist book in that it gives you very few orienting preambles. We're not told where it's set, we're not told when it's set. We imagine it's in the near future, maybe in a few decades, but nothing is clarified. The characterization is also kept to a bare minimum. The names, usually the first names or the second names, the surnames of some characters, and you tend to flit from one character to another, right? So there is use of polyfocality, this shifting perspective that the modernists invented, and it tends to be the dialogue tends to be unattributed also, right? So it doesn't say said James or whatever, right? So very often you don't actually know who's talking either. So the influence of T.S. Eliot's montage technique is quite strong in parts. Other parts of the novel are quite realistic, and you're able to orient yourself quite easily. So it's not radically experimental, but you do feel a strong impact of modernism. So that's heartening to feel that experimentation in the British novel is not dead by any means. I'll do a video on this actually, the rise of experimental, the resurgence of experimental fiction in Britain thanks to the Goldsmiths Prize. As I said, the plot is rather minimal, and the climax is actually both action-packed, so traditional in that sense, and contemplative in that it focuses on especially one of the characters inner torments and his coming to terms with that emotional torment. So now I'm sure some would critics might argue that the novel's characters are not endearing, that you don't get attached to them. Something that has been said, for example, of John McGregor's Reservoir 13, where you have the same flitting from one character to another. I would argue that the book doesn't try to do that. It doesn't try to to make you attached to the characters. They're not. The main point of the novel is not to make them particularly memorable. It's more to create an atmosphere. So it's not a character-based novel. It's more of a novel that is there to build up atmosphere. And the characters just contribute to that rather isolated atmosphere, that rather cold emotional atmosphere. So it is definitely worth reading. There are some stylistic effects that are interesting, like the prattle in the branches, or you have the wolf grey figures, something passive and silent, abruptly breaching the unbridled noise, and one of my favorites, the prehistoric patience of water. So if you had to categorize this novel, I'd say the best term is minimalism, which is one of the isms that comes from modernism. It's minimalist in most ways. Its prose style is pared down. It doesn't use that many adjectives. It tends to opt for the plain style most of the way. It's a very brief novel. Even the lines are spaced out, so the paragraphs are really small, and you have the feeling that the action is minimal. It's all about this fear of the sabotaging of the water train, and some unrest about the creating of an ice dock, a gigantic ice dock, which entails the towing of an iceberg, and it's going to displace more people than was originally thought. So it's the plot is minimal, which doesn't mean that there's no suspense, by the way. As I said, the characterization is kept to a bare minimum. And you have this general feeling that is what Cynan Jones is aiming for. This brings me to my third book, which is Night of the Long Goodbyes by Erik Martiny. Now, Night of the Long Goodbyes is more of what I would call a maximalist text, in that it doesn't aim for minimalist effects for the most part. You could say that most novels have moments of maximalism and moments of minimalism, in that even a maximalist text doesn't give you everything you need to know about every character, what they're wearing, in the high realist mode. But there are quite a few lyrical passages in this novel. It tends to deliver rather lush prose, if I may say so. The diction is quite Latinate, so it doesn't go for the plain style. On the contrary, the style is rather textured, layered, and this comes from my process, really, which is that I like most writers, I reread almost fanatically and add things as I go along. Unlike most novelists, I don't pair the text down, I add to it gradually. So you get this kind of layering effect. I tend to try to bejewel it if I can by adding details. And they're usually the details I savor the most when I reread after publication. So it's mostly purple prose, but not all the way. It's not heavy-going, lumpy prose. Now, you could say that the novel is a dystopia, as the cover suggests, right? This is an image taken from Hieronymus Bosch, as you've probably realized. And it's a dystopia, but while it does have some slightly nihilistic moments, this is counterbalanced by a kind of cheerful nihilism, where you have, it's a novel that is seriocomic. It's prescient in that you could say, well, it's based on a number of surreal pandemics, so you could say it's partially predicted the current situation. But like most speculative fiction, it doesn't aim to predict the future. It's not predictive in that most of the occurrences are rather surreal, which is, partly what we're feeling at the moment, thanks to COVID-19. Now, the main idea in the novel is this substance called the blue. Now, the blue is a kind of substance that looks a bit like snow, except it's blue, and even in midsummer it doesn't melt. It's also extremely supple and can be used to create these giant sculptures that people start building. So initially it's quite recreational, and people tend to, because no one can go to work, people end up using the stuff a lot in their gardens, even bring it into their homes to build huge snowmen. So it's a rather metamorphic substance, and as it tends to morph and change, eventually it hardens suddenly, and so you're left with this blue stuff hardened all over the streets and fields, and no food can be grown, and transport is made impossible. So eventually it turns to dust, and this tends to create a blue dust bowl that causes all sorts of lung diseases, etc. Now, you could say that it is linked to water in that initially it looks like trapped water, inaccessible water. When it hardens, you can't dent it in any way, you can't break into it in any way. And so I'll just read you a passage where this is suggested. So it's a passage that occurs at the start of the novel, where the character is going for a walk after the giant storm that makes the stuff harden. The more gigantic sculptures in the park loomed even more threateningly. Their surfaces shimmered with a kind of petroleum iridescence. I went up to inspect one and found to my consternation that it was hard as an iceberg. The formerly compacted yet still friable blue had given place to what felt like a cement-hardened surface. It was impossible to indent, at least with shoe tips, fingertips, and nails. All my efforts didn't leave as much as a scratch on the surface. So just to draw your attention to another passage where the blue is also seen as something that is linked to to water and to pollution. Most religions around the world unsurprisingly took the blue as a sign. In Christian circles, it was interpreted variously as a godsend, a manna sent by God to replenish his people. He wished to show us that he was still there. The blue snow was a theophanic manifestation. From the Vatican, the pro-blue Pope, His Holiness Pope Joy II, the first openly transgender pontiff, announced that God in his mercy had cast down his beneficence upon the world to reclaim it from the sin of pollution. It was God's way of renewing his covenant with man, his way of adding the finishing touch to creation. It was God's way of saving the planet from climate change and pollution, his very effective way of reducing traffic and industry. The Pope and his cardinals adduced that blue was the color of the Virgin, a symbol of purity and transcendence. He argued that color was synonymous with the light beams of God. It was an emanation of divinity, a manifestation of his beauty. Since the Middle Ages, blue was the holiest of colors. The fallen manna was absolute blue gold, a panoptic federating symbol of joy, love, honesty, loyalty, peace. It was the most noble and moral of all colors in the spectrum, the only color a true Christian should wear. 2 weeks after it fell, Pope Joy II had St. Peter's Basilica entirely painted over in an indelible coat of rainbow blue spectrum. The floor of the basilica was broken up by a heavy-duty pneumatic drill, and a holy indigo tree was made to grow out of the rubble in front of the altar. Most Catholic churches around the world followed suit, riffing freely with various shades of indigo, pastel, and woad. By contrast, Protestant splinter faiths were for the most part more skeptical about the blue and its supposed munificence. Protestant chromophobia had deep roots that went back to the beginning of the movement, so most Reformed faiths reaffirmed their belief in austerity. Protestant churches were repainted both inside and outside in a fresh, dazzling coat of whitewash to send out a bold statement. A Calvinist bishop in Germany declared that blue was die Teufelsfarbe, the color of the devil. So, as you can see, it's a rather allegorical text that